Bienvenue à l'Université d'Ottawa. Au nom du Centre de recherche et d'enseignement sur les droits de la personne, je vous remercie d'être ici ce soir avec nous. If you'd like to learn more about other events and projects that the Human Rights Research and Education Center here at the University of Ottawa is involved in, please do follow us on social media. And I believe there may be a sign-up sheet for our mailing list circulating somewhere. Okay, my name's Adam Houston. I'm a PhD student here in the Faculty of Law, and it's been my privilege to bring together this evening's great lineup of panelists to discuss some very important and very timely issues. But before we get to them, nous allons commencer avec quelques mots d'introduction sur le sujet sur notre sujet de quelqu'un avec beaucoup d'expérience sur les relations entre Canada et l'ONU. Il est un vrai plaisir de vous présenter l'ancien ministre de la Justice et de la Santé, l'ancien ambassadeur du Canada aux Nations Unies et actuellement le président de l'Université d'Ottawa, Mr. Alan Rock.
Alors, merci Adam et bonsoir mesdames et messieurs. Il me fait grand plaisir de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à l'Université d'Ottawa ce soir pour cette discussion importante. Nous sommes particulièrement heureux d'accueillir des participants de ce calibre et nous sommes honorés de votre présence sur le campus. And may I say what a personal pleasure it is to see Stephen Lewis back on campus. Always excited to see him here, and we're delighted that you're part of this tonight, Stephen. It's a great privilege for me to say just a few words of introduction, and then I regret that I have to excuse myself and go elsewhere. It is the life of a university president to go from event to event during the evening, and tonight I'm due at the Shaw Center, where our federal minister for Families and Children will help us inaugurate a new International Institute on Aging, a subject which used to be an academic one for me, but assuming a far more practical aspect all the time. I hope you'll forgive my leaving, and I look forward to learning from Adam tomorrow about the details of your discussion, which I would really very much like to stay for, but cannot. Il y a 6 mois, comme vous le savez très bien, les Canadiens et les Canadiennes ont élu un nouveau gouvernement. Un gouvernement qui a promis une nouvelle approche en politique étrangère après une décennie de mépris à l'égard du multilatéralisme et particulièrement les Nations unies. Le premier ministre Justin Trudeau a déclaré que le Canada est de retour, Canada is back, et a signalé sans équivoque qu'il voulait reprendre ses activités sur la scène internationale et renouer avec les affaires internationales. Entre autres choses, il s'est engagé à ce que le Canada joue un rôle actif et constructif aux Nations unies et il a annoncé que le Canada va présenter sa candidature au Conseil de sécurité dans 4 ans. In that context, a discussion about Canada's role in peacekeeping, in UN accountability, is both timely and important. This is a subject that has special significance for me. I hope you'll allow me to explain. My father spent his working life in the Canadian Army. He joined in 1939. He served overseas during World War II. He remained in the Army after his return. He retired as a staff sergeant after 30 years of service in 1969. One of the periods of his service of which my father was most proud was the 18 months he spent in the late 1950s wearing a blue helmet in the Middle East as part of the original United Nations Emergency Force created on the initiative of Lester Pearson. I still have the letters that he wrote home, telling us excitedly about the work he was doing, about the lines he was patrolling, about the deep satisfaction he was feeling, about bringing stability to a volatile area. My father's tour involved sacrifice on his part, but also for my mother, who was left as a single parent here in Ottawa with 4 rambunctious children, I have to say I feel guilty to this day for the major part I played in making her life far more difficult than necessary. Mais quand mon père est revenu à la maison, il a rapporté des objets portant le célèbre symbole bleu des Nations Unies. Nous les avons gardés fièrement en souvenir. Nous avions le sentiment que nous avions tous à notre façon collaboré à ces efforts nobles et courageux au service de la paix. Le monde semblait beaucoup plus simple à l'époque. Les temps ont bien changé. The UN peacekeeping brand has been stained indelibly by 3 unpardonable sins. The first, the profound breach of trust committed by those peacekeepers who abused their position to sexually exploit vulnerable persons in their care. The second, the damage negligently caused to the innocent in Haiti when UN operations contaminated the water supply and sickened hundreds of thousands of civilians, causing more than 9,000 deaths. And the third is the abject failure of the United Nations to own up to these misdeeds and to respond to them effectively and in a principled way. If he were still alive, I know my father would feel betrayed and angry. He would demand answers. He would insist on accountability. He would expect real reform and meaningful reparations. And he would, of course, be entirely right in doing so. There is much work to do if we are to restore the luster to the 1950s UN insignia that I still have in my home. And with a new government in place, Canada and Canadians can now take full part in that work. The Prime Minister has expressed bold ambitions. He has raised expectations. If we are to fulfill them, we will need clarity of purpose and constancy of effort. We will need a plan. And that's what tonight's panel is all about. Let's learn the lessons that emerge from past failures. Let's restore the pride we felt in past successes. Let's invoke the idealism that sent my father to the Sinai Peninsula those many years ago. Let's earn the quiet satisfaction that he felt in stern duty faithfully performed. And let's begin tonight as this panel of exceptional people turns its mind to the question, what is required and how can Canada help? Je vous remercie de votre participation et je vous souhaite de bonnes discussions. Merci.
All right. Thank you very much, Alan. I know that unfortunately you have other commitments, as you mentioned, but if those prove less scintillating than ours, you're more than welcome to come back, of course. Maintenant, je vais passer le micro à notre modérateur pour la soirée. John Packer est un professeur ici et directeur du centre. In addition to a very distinguished academic career at many fine institutions, almost as fine as the University of Ottawa, John brings considerable professional experience with him, including with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Labour Organization, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So, John Packer.
Thank you, Adam. Merci beaucoup pour l'introduction. It's my pleasure to be here this evening, and first of all, let me thank Adam for the initiative for this evening, which is evidently timely as Canada, as we've already heard from President Rock, Canada has determined to re-engage in the world through multilateralism and specifically in terms of the United Nations. Aside from thanking Adam for that introduction, and for noting the sincerity, evident sincerity of President Rock's remarks, let me just add a few words from my own perspective that in the last number of years, when I was also working with the United Nations Department of Political Affairs. And amid the kind of complexity of challenges which face the world in which we live today, the absence of Canada was noticeable, not only by our friends and allies, but in terms of the opportunities missed where we could have played a constructive role. And as a Canadian, there are in fact many Canadians actively working through the United Nations and other multilateral institutions in the world, but it was disheartening that our own government was not standing tall and contributing as we should as a member state of those organizations. And so therefore, I'm delighted by the commitment of this government to re-engage, specifically through multilateralism and expressly through the United Nations. But let me just add my own observation that it's not sufficient that Canada be back. I'm not sure that back was such a wonderful place. I think it's necessary in the 21st century that we need to get ahead. We need to come forward to the challenges of the contemporary world, which are complex, which are not that easy at all to navigate, and which require not only voluntarism, but a determination and some real skill in being able to navigate and possibly lead in some regards. It's certainly a point that when we come to the topic of peacekeeping, that what might be in the minds of many Canadians of a kind of romantic vision of an ideal separation of combating forces that we did lead, for example, in the context of Cyprus, are now rare to non-existent. That we now live in a world where we're facing complex emergencies, very dirty, messy situations, and we have to talk about the contemporary challenges as they exist now. And in that regard, I'm hoping that, and I'm expecting, and I'm confident that our panelists will present for us some of those challenges and where Canada can make a difference. We are honored and really blessed to have a wonderful panel this evening. What we will do is we'll hear from each of them for about 10 to 12 minutes and for some initial remarks. And at the conclusion of hearing from each of the speakers on the panel, then we'll open the floor for questions, answers, and discussions. Okay, so that will be the process. It's now my pleasure to introduce the first speaker, who is Peggy Mason. Peggy Mason is president of the Rideau Institute. Let me just say that she's also a celebrated graduate of our law school here. There's a nice picture of her up in our Roll of Honor, nice. I think on the third floor. Peggy was, as many of you know, Canada's ambassador for disarmament from 1989 to 1995, so she has her own impressive professional credentials. But let me say that in the many years that I've known Peggy, she's been a constant voice of integrity, of accuracy, of determination in expecting and holding Canada to the best of what Canadians, I think, expect of our country, which is that we really follow the declared values of the Charter of the United Nations, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that we are a force, or at least to the extent that we can, we contribute constructively to a more peaceful, more just, and a better world. In terms of Peggy's specific responsibilities, in the last number of years since she was Canada's ambassador for disarmament to the United Nations, she's spent about 15 years working as a regular. Many of you may have already benefited from her talents and skills as a trainer and a contributor to both political and diplomatic trainings with regard to the United Nations, NATO, the European Union, in various exercises regarding to prepare military commanders in exactly the kind of complex situations that we're going to talk about through multidisciplinary approaches. From 2002 to 2012, she was senior fellow at that place down the canal that we know but won't mention. Carleton University, our friends, of course. She participated specifically in training of Iraqi and Kuwaiti diplomats. God knows they need it today. She chaired the advisory board of the Canadian Centre for Treaty Compliance, another thing we all need to know about. And she's an active member of, so I see her periodically, at the Group of 78, the World Federalist Movement of Canada, and Pugwash Movement. So she brings an abundance of credentials. And Peggy, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And it's really a great pleasure. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici ce soir at my alma mater. What my presentation is entitled, Why UN Peacekeeping is Central to Sustainable Peace. And I've got 3 broad points. The first one, because we're going to be doing a lot of criticizing, I thought it was very important to start with reminding ourselves why it is so important that we get UN peacekeeping right. What is the value added of UN, that is blue helmet peacekeeping? That's going to be the bulk of my comments, but then I'm going to make a couple more. The second one is going to be on the importance of, first and foremost, holding UN member states, not the UN, but UN member states to account for the shocking level of impunity of military forces engaged in UN operations when they commit sexual abuse or other crimes. And the third point, the absolutely key role of training to ensure that peace operations live up to their potential, and therefore what Canada must do in training terms to prepare itself for its re-engagement with UN peacekeeping. First point, what is the value added of UN peacekeeping? My central point is that in response to violent conflict, giving priority to UN-led peace and security initiatives is the best way to pursue comprehensive, sustainable, political solutions to essentially political problems, albeit generally with an important supporting security dimension. And note that I said UN-led, not just UN-authorized. The latter being the bare minimum condition to be legal under international law, but in my view, insufficient to get the job done. Why UN peacekeeping? The UN has learned a lot about conflict resolution since the first military forces were deployed in UNEF 1 in 1956. I have to say, because I think it's worth reminding ourselves, what Canada's missed. We can't get back in there until we catch up. We can't lead until we catch up. The great tragedy for Canada is that having been such a preeminent UN peacekeeper for so long, our disengagement from UN Blue Helmet operations post-UNPROFOR in former Yugoslavia in 1995, when we began to commit the bulk of our forces to NATO-led operations, has left us institutionally almost completely unaware of the transformation in the planning, conduct, and management of UN-led operations since then, and even more important, in the conceptual underpinnings of UN peacekeeping. Specifically, the UN has learned that the broader process within which peacekeeping is situated, peace building, is a complex long-term process of helping the conflicting parties to create the necessary conditions, political, economic, security, for a sustainable peace. At the center of this effort is the peace process. Complex political problems lie at the heart of violent conflict and require political solutions negotiated and agreed by the parties. A robust security element may be essential in both the negotiation and implementation phases, but it is a supporting element nonetheless. As the Afghanistan debacle has so dramatically and tragically illustrated, no amount of military robustness and professionalism on the part of international military forces can make up for the lack of a credible peace process. And I would say as an aside, I'm not an expert on Haiti, we have very good experts here. I would say that Haiti too is potent evidence of a defective political framework, a non-inclusive political framework. With the primacy of the peace process in mind, today's multidimensional UN peacekeeping operations are therefore not only called upon to maintain peace and security, the supporting military dimension, and to promote, but also to promote the rule of law, to facilitate the political process, and to support the establishment of legitimate and effective institutions of governance. So, the point is the military is very much a supporting actor in this much broader effort. For a collective enterprise of this magnitude to succeed, as UN peacekeeping, in spite of all of its problems, does more often than not, the international effort must be perceived as legitimate and impartial by all or most of the parties to the conflict, and it must have the broadest possible international support within a coherent legal and operational framework. I mean, in order to have half a chance at doing what it's trying to do, these are the minimum conditions. Only the UN Security Council can mandate such an operation, and only the UN organization can even notionally lead it, if only because there is simply no other single entity acceptable to the international community. Headed by a civilian in the role of the special representative of the UN Secretary General, the SRSG, and we have a former Canadian SRSG here. I'm looking around trying to see her.
Carolyn.
She was SRSG in Burundi, headed by the special representative of the Secretary General, with all the other components, including the military and police, reporting to him or her. The very structure of the UN peacekeeping operation reflects the centrality of the peace process. This stands in sharp contrast to NATO-led missions or other regionally led missions authorized by the UN Security Council to assist in stabilizing a conflict, where the military mission is a completely separate one from the UN political, diplomatic, humanitarian, development, and governance mission. How can the military effectively support the peace process under a separate command structure? My 10 years of training with senior military commanders, mainly senior NATO military commanders, some EU, some UN, preparing them for their deployments to Afghanistan, Bosnia, or Kosovo, have demonstrated time and again that a divided command structure at the operational level is a recipe for an ineffective command structure. There's another stark problem with NATO or regionally led stability operations. They lack the perceived legitimacy and impartiality of UN-led operations precisely because their political and military leadership represent a very specific set of countries and interests, UN authorization and the presence of some non-NATO countries notwithstanding. This not only undermines coherence in the international effort, but is a gift to spoilers on the ground, decrying foreign occupation. I might add that this problem of lack of broad legitimacy and vested interests also plagues other missions with a regional military component, notably the African Union, but I have no direct experience of how that works in practice. To recap, the main comparative advantages for UN operations are its integrated command structure under civilian authority, which in turn reflects the primacy of the peace process and which facilitates unity of purpose, and the fact that the UN is the only organization through which the forces of the P5 and all other major powers and regional and rising powers can jointly participate. Only the UN, therefore, offers the option of a politically diverse and operationally capable mission, but if and only if the P5 and other major powers, Western nations, re-engage. And that, of course, is not the case at this point. Canada's, of the 90,000 blue helmets, 90+ thousand blue helmets in the field right now, I think it's around 30 Canadian military. And EU members now comprise only 7% of the overall UN forces. So the point here is UN peacekeeping cannot begin to live up to its potential to assist countries in transition from civil war to stable governance unless it has the resources to do the job. This is why Canada's intention to re-engage in UN peacekeeping is so welcome. But to do so effectively, it has a lot to catch up on, and that leads me very briefly to my two further points. Second point, on accountability for abuses by military forces in UN peace operations. No UN member state, including Canada, will surrender to the UN or even share with the UN responsibility for legal accountability of its forces when operating under UN command. The same is true of NATO operations, with the military forces of each country continuing to be held accountable under each country's, or not, under each country's own national laws and military codes of procedure. The only exception here, I hasten to say, and it's a huge step forward, is when the conduct rises to the level of an international crime within the jurisdiction of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Even then, the ICC is a court of last resort, and of course there are other jurisdictional issues. There is virtually no likelihood that this national holding on to national responsibility for alleged crimes committed by military forces. There's no likelihood that this will change. So a central part of our effort must be to improve, to the maximum extent possible, national actions to ensure accountability. Of course, I am in no way absolving the UN from actions it can take, and other speakers will focus on that. My point is that this is first and foremost a problem of national military forces under national command at the tactical level. And the higher military commanders of a UN, NATO, EU mission have no responsibility. It's the tactical level commander at the national level. This is not going to happen, I would suggest, as long as member states can hide behind the convenient UN scapegoat, the UN. So, first and foremost, we have to make it clear that these are national forces under national command at the tactical level, and therefore the prime responsibility falls on member states to take action. To put this another way, this is a military discipline problem first and foremost, and it's up to militaries and their national governments providing forces to take ownership of this and devise effective strategies in common for training, oversight, and response. And this leads me to my third point, the absolutely central and fundamental role that peacekeeping training must play to ensure that UN peacekeeping lives up to its potential. The multidimensional nature of UN peacekeeping requires that a diverse array of international actors, both inside and outside the UN mission, work effectively together. And that they work effectively together with each other and also in relation to the equally diverse array of local actors. One of the key tasks of peacekeeping training is to help prepare the military, the police, and all the various civilian components of the mission for this vital cooperation, so that they learn how to understand not only the scope of their own role, but how it relates to the role of the other components of the mission. A core concept of this training must be to include the centrality of the peace process and the supporting role of the military in relation to it. In military jargon, the center of gravity of the mission is not the military, but the peace process. This training needs to be supported by policy-relevant research that includes the development of best practices, standard operating procedures, and doctrinal work in relation to all the components of the mission. So what does this mean for Canada? If we're going to re-engage in UN peacekeeping, let alone show leadership in international training, as the Liberals have promised in their election campaign, and now it's in the Defence Minister's mandate letter, we need to get our own house in order. We need to reinvent, because we now no longer have an international peacekeeping training centre along the lines I've just described, with sufficient funding to permit interdisciplinary training and inclusion of developing country and other military forces in it. A priority area should be to develop doctrine and procedures on which training can be based, because that's how training works in the military. They develop the doctrine and the procedures, and then they train on it over and over and over. And so two areas that I think Canada can make a huge contribution in terms of the training centre developing doctrine and procedures would be in the area of the very challenging area of military forces providing protection of civilians in imminent danger. This is an area where there's a huge amount of UN practice and lessons learned, but almost no doctrine or broadly agreed standard operating procedures. And of course, the second priority area, given the serious misconduct of military forces in recent years, would be measures to enhance the accountability of international military forces. That is the development of agreed measures on prevention, oversight, and accountability, building on military codes of conduct. And so the aim would be that Canada's International Peacekeeping Training Centre could start to develop some of this, but through the Association of International Peacekeeping Training Centres, as well as through UN mechanisms like the Special Committee on Peacekeeping, we would get broad support and then concrete commitment to these mechanisms. A final word on this type of international peacekeeping training. By reinforcing the centrality of the peace process to all participants, civilian and military alike, we can begin to shed greater light on the catastrophically wrong-headed approach to date in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and Iraq, where virtually the entire focus has been on military actions and not on addressing the political underpinnings of the conflict. Thank you very much.
Wow.
Jesus, you know too much.
Well, thank you very much, Peggy, for that great way to start us off. Before introducing our second speaker, let me just add a clarification, which I was remiss to mention in my prior remarks. Some of you will have noticed that in the circulation or advertising for this event, among other things, there was a phrase which said, as Canada seeks to reassert its historical leadership role in UN peacekeeping, and it contemplates taking over leadership of the UN stabilization mission in Haiti, we received some expressions of concern, actually questions, what did we know about Canada reasserting? And just to be clear, we don't know. So it really should have said, as Canada may contemplate or may consider, but just to be sure, as far as I understand now, there is no determination on the part of the Canadian government, but it may. And this is exactly, if we follow from the idea that Canada is re-engaging and has an intention to play a more active role and determined role, that this is a part of the world where historically Canada has played a role and may well again. So that small caveat or explanation shared. It's now my great pleasure, c'est mon grand plaisir de vous présenter M. Mario Joseph, qui est un avocat et le responsable pour le Bureau des avocats international, qui est le vieux cabinet des avocats en Haiti. Under Mr. Joseph's leadership, the Bureau des Avocats International has spearheaded a number of Haiti's main human rights cases, including seeking accountability specifically for UN in introducing cholera to Haiti and for prosecuting crimes against humanity perpetrated by Baby Doc Duvalier and the regime. In the year 2000, BAE successfully prosecuted 53 individuals responsible for the Reboteau massacre. We should have you come and speak to our students. There would be many who would be amazed to hear about this, which is regarded as one of the most significant human rights trials in the Western Hemisphere. BAE is also has played one of the pivotal roles in making Haiti's justice system more accessible to gender-based violence and for other marginalized groups, including political prisoners. Mr. Joseph has testified before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, before a number of American courts, and has served on Haiti's Law Reform Commission. It's another institution we used to have in Canada, but don't have anymore. In fact, allow me just to say in parenthesis, we had the first Law Reform Commission in the world, and for many years in different parts of the world, I spent my time promoting the adoption of such national institutions for the protection of human rights, and everyone was very interested to hear about the Canadian experience, and now we don't have one. But everyone else seems to be following it. Very strange. So not only do we need to restore the peacekeeping training center, we also need a new Law Reform Commission. Mr. Joseph is an educator. He's a graduate of Haiti's Teacher College. He has frequently appeared on radio, television, and public information news items on various legal issues within Haiti. The New York Times has called Mr. Joseph Haiti's most prominent human rights lawyer. He's a recipient of numerous awards, and he was a finalist in 2013 for the Martin Ennals Award. Martin Ennals, for those of you who don't know, is founder of many major human rights organizations, including Amnesty International. Monsieur Joseph, c'est votre parole.
Merci, Monsieur Paquet. Bonsoir tout le monde. Je voudrais, permettez-moi de remercier l'Université d'Ottawa et pour avoir organisé ce colloque. Et je dois aussi remercier l'audience, aussi sélect qui est ici avec nous. Et comme M. Paquet vient de le dire, je suis Marie-Joseph, avocat défenseur des droits humains, et je dirige le bureau des avocats internationaux en Haïti, à Port-au-Prince. Et ça va faire d'ici le mois de juillet, ça va faire 20 ans. Et une première partie avec mon collègue Brian qui est ici. Il était en Haïti, nous avons co-dirigé. Et quand il a laissé après le coup en 2004, et il m'a laissé seul là-bas. Mais pas seul toujours, mais il fait, et avec l'Institut pour la démocratie et la justice, il cherche un peu d'argent pour nous, afin que nous puissions continuer le travail assister les plus pauvres et qui n'ont pas l'accès à la justice. Et je suis au Canada, c'est justement sur l'invitation de la communauté haïtienne à Montréal et qui nous a invités et qui a écrit aussi une lettre au Premier ministre canadien pour chercher la solidarité du Canada dans la situation, disons dans la crise qu'on a en Haïti avec la MINUSTA et les Nations Unies. Et je suis là aussi parce que le gouvernement canadien a annoncé son intention de se réengager dans les opérations de maintien de la paix de l'ONU et de prioriser la protection des droits humains et l'assistance aux plus pauvres, aux plus vulnérables dans sa politique étrangère. Puisque nous autres, au niveau du Bureau des avocats internationaux, au niveau de l'Institut, du JDH, et nous avons notre option préférentielle, les plus pauvres en Haïti. Donc, nous disons, nous devons répondre présent et voir comment nous pouvons pousser le gouvernement canadien à prendre une certaine responsabilité. Et aussi, comme avocat, défenseur des droits humains, nous sommes intéressés au principe des droits humains, évoqué pour justifier les missions de paix. Cependant, la situation de la MINUSTA montre que les principes des droits humains sont galvaudés ou n'existent pas en Haïti. Je veux voir aussi si le gouvernement canadien est sérieux dans son intention de protéger les droits humains, comment il va s'engager dans cette situation qu'on a en Haïti avec la MINUSTA. Et là, puisque les Nations Unies se réclament défenseurs des droits humains, car elles font la promotion des droits humains, et que nous remarquons en Haïti, il y a un système de déploiement et de mesures, car nous savons que les droits humains sont universels. Il semblerait qu'il y a un droit humain au Canada, aux États-Unis, et un autre en Haïti, tout différent. Là, je vais vous expliquer ce soir le comportement des Nations Unies et l'impunité dont jouissait, on jouit encore, et peut-être verront les Nations Unies. Je veux le parler à trois niveaux. Au niveau individuel, c'est-à-dire avec les cas d'abus sexuels, et au niveau du manque de responsabilité institutionnelle même des Nations Unies, de la mission. Maintenant, je vais l'expliquer avec le choléra en Haïti. Et au niveau du manque de mécanismes ou violation de l'accord de siège signé entre Haïti, le gouvernement haïtien et les Nations Unies le 9 juillet 2004. Et le premier niveau, je vous donne l'exemple rapidement. Et en 2008, les Nations Unies ont rapatrié, on fait un rapatriement massif de 114 soldats sri-lankais de la MINUSTA, suite aux allégations d'abus sexuels des filles mineures sur une base de la MINUSTA en Haïti. Et vous le savez, le rapatriement bloque les enquêtes. On ne peut pas parler de la justice parce qu'une fois rapatrié, le dossier est complètement bloqué. Et les Nations Unies n'ont rien fait pour ces victimes de viol. Et certaines fois, ces viols sont assortis d'une grossesse. Aujourd'hui en Haïti, il y a plusieurs cas, plusieurs mères mineures qui portent encore des enfants. Au niveau du BAI, nous avons environ 6 cas. Des enfants des soldats de la MINUSTA qui ne peuvent pas aller à l'école, qui n'ont pas droit à la nourriture, qui n'ont pas droit à la santé. Et vous savez, on le disait, Haïti est un pays pauvre. Cette situation rendait encore Haïti. Moi, je le disais toujours, Haïti est un pays qu'on a appauvri. Cette situation allait de toute manière appauvrir la famille haïtienne. Et dans certains cas, les Nations Unies, les accusations ont provoqué une enquête, peut-être spéciale, nous disons, les Nations Unies. Et on peut prendre le cas de Johnny Charles. Et il y avait eu une parodie de justice à Uruguay, mais aucune indemnité pour lui. Et les soldats qui ont sodomisé Johnny Charles sont libres comme le vent dans leur pays. Et vous savez, les stigmatisations dont sont victimes ce jeune homme, ces mineurs, violés, sodomisés par des soldats uruguayens. Et au niveau institutionnel de la MINUSTA, et comment rechercher ou bien retrouver la paternité? Les mères victimes n'ont pas accès à aucun mécanisme pouvant les permettre de rechercher la paternité de leurs enfants. Car tout est bloqué, on ne peut rien faire et le soldat est retourné. Donc c'est des cas que nous documentons et nous cherchons et quoi faire. Et peut-être en tant qu'avocat haïtien, nous pensons à faire une action en pension alimentaire. Mais pour intenter cette action en pension alimentaire, il nous faut l'acte de naissance. Est-ce que le père a déclaré avant son départ, avant son rapatriement? Et si c'est le cas, comme avec les mères, avec des déclarations des mères, on ne pouvait pas intenter cette action en pension alimentaire. Donc, c'est des gens qui sont dans une situation vraiment difficile. Et nous autres avocats, nous cherchons, nous regardons quoi faire. Mais c'est encore difficile car il n'y a pas de mécanisme. C'est un système opaque. Et pourtant, à travers le monde, on parle des Nations Unies comme étant la plus grande organisation qui respecte ou bien qui fait la promotion des droits humains. C'est pourquoi je disais tantôt, est-ce que les Haïtiens n'ont pas aussi des droits? Quand le choléra a éclaté en Haïti, il faut être clair que les Haïtiens ont perdu leur confiance dans cette mission de paix. Certaines fois, on l'appelle force d'occupation. D'autres fois, on l'appelle tourista, parce qu'ils font beaucoup plus de touristes. Et peut-être, vous pouvez le comprendre. Et si on prend l'objectif de cette mission, c'était les droits humains, la bonne gouvernance et la professionnalisation de la police. Je ne sais pas où est-ce qu'on en est avec la professionnalisation de la police. Mais quant à la démocratie, regardons tout près de nous, il n'y avait pas eu d'élection en Haïti depuis 5 ans. Et le dernier en date, ce n'était pas des élections, je vous le dis franchement. C'est pourquoi, aujourd'hui, on a mis en place une commission d'investigation, mais de vérification pour savoir, et je pense que le peuple haïtien a ce droit de savoir qu'est-ce qui s'était passé le 9 août, le 25 janvier. Comme au Canada, il y avait beaucoup de commissions de vérification, ou bien d'enquête, pour savoir. Nous avons ce droit. Même si les États-Unis n'en voulaient pas, ne veulent pas, mais nous avons ce droit. Et en effet, en octobre 2010, 10 mois après le tremblement de terre, le choléra a éclaté en Haïti. En réalité, nous ne connaissons pas cette épidémie, cette maladie. Ma maman, qui était vieux de 74 ans, je lui avais fait la question sur le choléra, elle ne savait pas. C'est-à-dire, je peux dire, près de 80 ans, et nous ne connaissons pas. Car maman, maintenant, elle est morte, mais elle devait avoir 80 ans cette année. Et maintenant, nous autres, en tant qu'avocats, nous pensons que les Nations Unies, qui se dit et qui fait la promotion des droits humains, allait prendre ses responsabilités. C'est pourquoi nous attendons jusqu'en novembre 2011, ou du moins en mai 2011, quand les propres experts, les experts des Nations Unies disaient que ce sont les soldats népalais qui ont introduit le choléra en Haïti. Et ils disaient à côté, prétextant à côté, c'est parce que Haïti est un pays faible en sanitation. Il n'y avait pas d'eau potable, c'est pourquoi le choléra s'est répandu en Haïti. Nous disons que nous ne pouvons pas accepter ce prétexte, car les Nations Unies savaient déjà que Haïti était un pays faible en sanitation, il n'y avait pas d'eau potable. Donc, elles devaient traiter, diagnostiquer le choléra parce que, au Népal, le choléra est endémique. Mais en plus de tout ça, voyons le traitement des matières fécales des soldats qui étaient sur la base de la MINUSA à Meille, non loin de Mirebalais. C'est clair, derrière la base, il y a un affluent du plus grand fleuve d'Haïti, le fleuve Artibonite. Et c'est facilement si les matières fécales qui sont déversées à côté, qui ne sont maltraitées, c'était visible. Donc, nous ne pouvons pas accepter ce prétexte de négligence des Nations Unies. Pourquoi? Et en novembre 2011, nous déposons une plainte contre les Nations Unies. Maintenant, je pense, nous sommes dans une école de droit, vous allez poser, mais où? Mais aussi, je vais vous dire aussi, quel mécanisme? Quel mécanisme? Qu'est-ce que les Nations Unies, ce grand organisme, nous donne pour rester en justice, pour introduire une action en justice, quand il y a une malfaisance ou bien il y a violation des droits humains? Aucun mécanisme, jusqu'à date. Aucun mécanisme. Donc, nous sommes bien obligés. Et vous allez peut-être nous dire, mais quel argument? Parce que les Nations Unies ont l'humilité. Oui, nous sommes d'accord. Nous sommes d'accord. Et nous sommes d'accord. Mais quand nous regardons l'accord de siège signé entre le gouvernement haïtien et les Nations Unies en 2004, nous voyons dans l'article 54 l'immunité. Mais nous voyons aussi une commission de réclamation permanente. Cette année, ça va faire 12 ans. Jamais cette commission n'a pas été mise en place. C'est-à-dire, les Nations Unies violent son propre accord pour n'avoir pas mis en place cette commission de réclamation. C'est pourquoi nous sommes à New York aujourd'hui. c'est parce qu'il n'y a pas cette commission de réclamation. C'est-à-dire les victimes de viol, de sodomisation, les victimes de choléra ne peuvent pas trouver justice car il n'y a pas de mécanisme. Et 15 mois après le dépôt de notre plainte, les Nations Unies rejettent la plainte, à savoir que avec cette documentation d'immunité. Nous disons en tant qu'avocat, l'immunité n'est pas impunité, c'est deux choses différentes. C'est-à-dire, et si au niveau de l'article 54, les Nations Unies ont l'immunité, au niveau de l'article 54, il faut qu'elle donne une alternative. C'est cette alternative qu'on n'en a pas. Pas seulement l'accord de siège, mais la convention de 1946 sur les immunités et les privilèges des Nations Unies. Il y a une partie qui parle de l'immunité et une autre partie de l'alternative. Le peuple haïtien, les victimes du choléra, n'ont pas cette alternative jusqu'à ce moment où je vous parle. Donc, c'est cette situation et que nous confrontons, et pourtant, le choléra continue sa course, continue à faire ses ravages. Comme vous le comprendre, le choléra, ce n'est pas une maladie médicale, c'est une maladie environnementale. Et au cours du mois de janvier et février 2016, il y avait eu quelques gouttes de pluie. Il y avait près de 96 personnes tuées par le choléra. Tout près de nous. Et maintenant, nous sommes dans la pleine saison pluvieuse. Et est-ce que nous allons encore compter des morts et des infectés? C'est pourquoi nous sommes là aujourd'hui. Et pour vous montrer la présence de la MINUSTA, comment ça nuit, comment ça appauvrit, comment ça viole les droits humains en Haïti. On le sait. Et moi, je peux encore retourner et vous faire la question. Et j'ai rencontré pas mal de professeurs de droit international. Expliquez-nous, dis-nous, est-ce que la présence de la MINUSTA en Haïti est légale ou illégale? Personne, et jusqu'à là, ne peut pas nous expliquer que la présence, ce déploiement est légal. Est conforme à l'article 7 de la Charte des Nations Unies. Haïti n'était pas en guerre. Haïti n'était pas une menace pour la paix, car il n'y avait aucune agression contre la République dominicaine, contre Cuba, qui sont nos voisins les plus proches. Donc, nous autres en Haïti, nous avons notre propre opinion sur cette présence. Mais n'en parlons pas de démocratie, n'en parlons pas de droits de l'homme, n'en parlons pas de bonne gouvernance. Moi, je vois plutôt, si on parle de gouvernance maintenant, il n'y a pas eu d'élection pendant le gouvernement de M. Martelly. Jamais la MINUSTA n'a rien dit, n'a pipé mot. Et les élections de 2015, vous le savez maintenant, sont en train d'être vérifiées. Et vous connaissez les menaces, l'ingérence, les pressions sur Haïti pour valider, pour avaler cette élection. Bon, c'est quelque chose d'haïtien, mais de toute manière, Haïti ne veut pas s'isoler. Mais nous nous cherchons avec nos amis et la communauté haïtienne au Canada, nous cherchons un peu comment amener le gouvernement canadien. J'ai été hier soir quelque part, je vois beaucoup de missions du Canada à travers le monde. Mais nous voulons vraiment une mission de paix, pas une force d'occupation. Et maintenant, les Nations Unies ne peuvent pas, et jusqu'à date, assurer la légalité des casques bleus. Et maintenant, on a déployé cette mission sur le chapitre 7. Et je vous disais tantôt que Haïti n'était pas en guerre et n'était pas une menace. Mais le comportement de certains pays, par exemple comme le Brésil, pendant que le Brésil tuait et les gens s'attisaient au soleil, et les télévisions au Brésil montraient les soldats qui donnaient de l'eau, de la nourriture. Ce n'est pas correct. Et maintenant, ce que vous devez savoir, ce manque de responsabilité des Nations Unies, ça décrédibilise ou bien ça nuit à la réputation de l'organisation. Ça ne fait pas l'honneur de cette grande organisation mondiale qui fait la promotion des droits humains. Et si, peut-être on va voir, on peut prendre, il y a un exemple. Alors, pour finir, il y a des experts des Nations Unies. Je pense peut-être si j'ai ça là, voilà. Des experts même des Nations Unies. Par exemple, le rapporteur spécial sur le logement convenable en tant qu'élément du droit à un niveau de vie suffisant, ainsi que le droit à la non-discrimination à cet égard. Il y a le rapporteur sur l'extrême pauvreté et les droits de l'homme. Et l'expert indépendant de la situation des droits humains en Haïti. Il y a le rapporteur spécial sur le droit qu'a toute personne de jouir du meilleur état de santé physique, mental possible. Il y a aussi le rapporteur spécial sur le droit à l'eau potable et à l'assainissement, qui disent, et je lis pour vous, en tant que rapporteurs spéciaux nommés par le Conseil de sécurité des droits de l'homme, nous ne pouvons manquer d'observer que les Nations Unies ont une responsabilité particulière d'assurer qu'un très large nombre des victimes ne soient pas laissées sans recours effectif pour des violations des droits de l'homme résultant d'actions de troupes agissant sous l'autorité des Nations Unies. Ce sont les propres experts, les propres rapporteurs des Nations Unies. Donc, je vous convie, chère audience, car notre mission cette semaine, nous étions à Montréal et à la mobilisation de la communauté haïtienne à Montréal. Et j'étais dans une radio avec Jean Africa, c'est Bouillon Racine, et justement pour sensibiliser le gouvernement canadien. Et vous sensibiliser. Et vous informer. Car en vous informant, vous allez vous engager. Je vous demande de vous engager à côté du peuple haïtien. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, M. Joseph, pour votre discours. C'est maintenant mon plaisir de vous présenter notre troisième conférencière, Mme Beatrice Lindstrom, qui est une avocate de l'Institut de la justice et de démocratie en Haïti. She's been involved in a number of high-profile litigations, specifically in an effort to hold the United Nations accountable for devastation from the cholera epidemic. the case, of course, which we've been discussing and we just heard details about. Beatrice is formerly has worked with Freedom House and is a frequent lecturer at a number of universities, appeared in international media, including the BBC, National Public Radio, and New York Times. Before joining the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti, she was the Arthur Helton Global Human Rights Fellow at the Bureau des Avocats Internationaux en Haiti avec Monsieur Joseph. For those of you who don't know Arthur Helton, he was one of the leading experts in the world on international migration, used to lead the Open Society Institute's Global Migration Project before his untimely death at the United Nations compound in Baghdad in 2003. Beatrice holds degrees in law from New York University School of Law and holds a degree from Emory University. In 2015, she was a recipient of NYU's Law Alumni Association Recent Graduates Award.
Thank you, John. So I think what I would like to do is spend a little bit of time putting what Mario has said in the broader context of the UN peacekeeping framework. And as Peggy mentioned, there's a complex set of rules that govern when a peacekeeper is responsible for causing a violation of human rights. And there's a combination of organizational responsibility and troop contributing responsibility, as well as individual responsibility that kicks in those situations. But what I would like to focus on here is responsibility at the level of the organization, since that's the aspect that I think is the most relevant to the question of cholera in Haiti. And before we get there, I think when we have these conversations about accountability, it's often, I think it can be easy to get lost in abstract concepts of law. And so I just want to spend a couple of minutes explaining what accountability means in the situation of cholera. So our clients, victims who are communities who have been victims of cholera in Haiti, have asked for three things. First, they've asked for investment in water and sanitation infrastructure to help eliminate cholera from Haiti. And the reason why that's important, as Mario said, is because cholera is still very much an ongoing humanitarian emergency. 6 years, going on 6 years since MINUSTA brought the disease to Haiti. We have worked with a woman named Renette, whose young baby died from cholera a couple of months after she was born. And her resounding message was that she is still afraid of contracting cholera. She says, I am afraid for my children because this is an ongoing threat. Similarly, a man named Miradieu has said that he still does not have access to clean water, that still the river that carried cholera is all we have. And so on that level, accountability means investment in water and sanitation to eliminate cholera from Haiti. I think it also means compensation for victims. We have a client who lives in Mirbalais, close to where the UN base is, and her brother and her father both died from cholera. They were the two breadwinners of the family, and so as a result of these family members' deaths, they've had to pull their at the time 10-year-old girl out of school because of the crushing debt that they had to undertake in order to pay for the funeral of their father and their brother. These are the types of injuries that we're looking for compensation for. And finally, but importantly, it also involves a public acceptance of responsibility, which to date still has not happened, despite the fact that the UN's own experts have established UN responsibility. There was an interview with a community health worker in Haiti who said that if the UN cared about our humanity, it would have apologized a long time ago. And I think that speaks to the affront to dignity that this has been for Haitians and continues to be for Haitians when the UN doesn't respond. Now, these may seem like big asks, but the idea of an accountable UN peacekeeping force is by no means a new concept. This is a commitment that the UN has already articulated in a number of its documents. It's a principle that the UN has said it in no uncertain terms that it is committed to, dating back to the 1950s and 60s when peacekeeping was first getting fleshed out. And so Mario mentioned the Convention on Privileges and Immunities, and I just want to reiterate that Section 29 of that treaty says the UN shall, it uses the word shall, which means it is mandatory for the UN to provide appropriate modes of settlement for private law claims that are filed against it, normally understood to be things like claims for personal injury, contract claims, things like that. Specifically, the Status of Forces Agreement that's signed between Haiti and the UN, but also the Status of Forces Agreements that are signed every time there's a UN peacekeeping mission that's deployed into the world, has a clause that says, and I quote from the clause, third-party claims for personal injury, illness, or death attributable to the peacekeeping force shall be settled by a standing claims commission. And as Mario mentioned, this is the very body that we've petitioned for to be established so that there can be some independent actor to hear and decide these claims. But not only has the UN failed to establish a standing claims commission in Haiti, it also has failed to establish one anywhere in the world, despite having entered into 32 agreements with this exact clause in it since 1994. And so the result of this is a vast lack of accountability mechanisms, that there is nowhere where victims can turn when there has been an injury. And the UN, in fact, did a review of this clause that calls for the Standing Claims Commission in light of the fact that it had never been complied with. And there was a request to the Secretary General to commission a study on this clause specifically to look into whether this clause should be removed from the Status of Forces Agreements altogether, since it wasn't actually being used. And after conducting this study, the Secretary General came back and said, well, we can't remove it from the Status of Forces Agreement because it is the only way, in light of our immunity, that victims will have access to an independent body to adjudicate their claims. And what we can't do is to be seen as acting as the judge in our own case. That was the words of the Secretary General in reviewing that clause. Yet since that time, this was in the 90s, still the clause has not been complied with. And I think what you see in Haiti is the enormous effects of that failure to comply. This is a case where the UN has offered as a reason for not receiving the claims that we filed and for not establishing the Claims Commission, that the claims were not receivable because they involve a review of policy or politics. Now, many people ask us when we say that, well, what does that mean? And the answer is that we don't know. This is language that has been studied extensively by some of the world's foremost experts on UN law and international law, who have uniformly come to the conclusion that this is essentially bogus language that was made up because the UN didn't want to deal with the claims. And so they deemed them not receivable to put a period to the story. So we said, well, if the claims are not receivable and you have an obligation to establish a claims commission as a way to provide an independent review when you can't resolve your claims internally, let's establish a claims commission, let's have an independent body look at it. And the response we received was, well, because the claims are not receivable, we have no obligation to establish a claims commission. And so we have here the Office of Legal Affairs of the United Nations, I think, acting, having issued a unilateral decision that obviously serves the interest of the UN in a case where it itself is essentially the defendant. And I think if we take a moment to reflect on in what world, in what legal system would we call that due process? Would we call that justice? Yet this is the United Nations. This was their response. And so as Mario mentioned, we ended up filing a lawsuit as a last resort to try to hold the UN to this promise of establishing an alternative mechanism. And that is something that's currently before the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in New York. And our argument is that the UN cannot continue to claim immunity in situations where it hasn't provided an alternative. Immunity has always been a two-way street. The idea has always been, yes, we will protect the UN from adjudication in national courts, but in exchange for doing something for victims. And so I think what we're asking for in this case is simultaneously both very modest but also revolutionary. I think it's modest in the sense that the only thing we're really asking for is for the UN to implement the promises that it has put on paper, to do exactly what it's asking Haitians to do in Haiti when it promotes the rule of law, to follow the letter of the law as it is written on the papers, and to not depart from that. At the same time, I think what we're asking for is revolutionary because of the very real accountability crisis that exists not only in the context of cholera. You're probably well aware of the many, many news stories that have come out recently about sexual violence, especially in the Central African Republic, and that our colleagues from AIDS-Free World have very much led on the fight for to put an end to impunity for sexual violence. And I think one of the things that needs to happen in order to address these issues is we need to acknowledge that the UN system currently suffers from an accountability crisis that can't be solved if we pick off issues here and there and deal with it at that level. But I think we need to acknowledge that there's a big general culture of impunity that we've allowed to fester in many ways, but that also can be dealt with. Alan Rock spoke at the beginning about 3 sins that the UN has committed. And certainly there's a lot that can be done to prevent this from happening, to put an end to sexual abuse, to prevent another cholera epidemic or similar disaster from unfolding at the hands of UN peacekeepers. But I want to focus on the 3rd sin because I think that is one that perhaps is not yet a fait accompli. I think there's still very much an opportunity to make this right, very much an opportunity to still act to provide justice to victims of cholera in Haiti. And here, I think, especially with the Canadian government re-engaging in peacekeeping, that there's a very real opportunity to lead on this effort. As Mario mentioned, there are many, many people within the UN system who have been calling on the UN to make this right. I think but where we haven't yet seen progress is at the level of member states taking a principled stance and helping the Secretariat figure out solutions. And that is a very constructive area where Canada can engage, where there's extensive expertise that comes from Canada's long history in peacekeeping, Canada's involvement with Haiti, and Canada's commitment to human rights, and I think especially this current government's commitment to human rights, to start engaging in those conversations, but also to leading the way on those conversations. And there we still have an opportunity to make a difference. And I look forward to discussing that more with you and getting into the details, hopefully, in our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lidstrom. And now it's my special pleasure and honor to introduce our 4th and final speaker before we'll open up the floor. He really doesn't need an introduction, but it's actually my privilege to provide that introduction. Our 4th speaker is Mr. Stephen Lewis. He's the co-founder and co-director of AIDS-Free World, an international advocacy organization that exposes injustice, abuse, and inequality, the social ills that underpin and continue to sustain HIV. In addition to AIDS-Free World, Mr. Lewis was a professor of distinction at Ryerson University and a professor of practice in global governance at the Institute for the Study of International Development at McGill University. He was a co-founder and board chair of the Stephen Lewis Foundation and a senior fellow at the Enough Project. If you don't know about the Enough Project, check it out on a website. It's a fabulous website with a kind of who's who of everybody important in the world supporting it. He served on the Global Commission on HIV and the Law. In 2015, Mr. Lewis was appointed to the Lancet Commission on Drug Policy and Health. He was the United Nations Secretary General's Special Envoy for HIV/AIDS in Africa from 2001 to the end of 2006. Prior to that, in 1995 to 1999, Mr. Lewis was the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF. And before that, from 1984 to 1988, he was Canada's Ambassador to the United Nations. Of course, he's known to many of us as the former head of the NDP in this province of Ontario. I have to say that, Mr. Lewis, when you left to go to the United Nations, some of us lamented that because we were hoping you had greater prospects in Canada, but we were delighted to see what you achieved in the United Nations after that. Mr. Lewis is a member or companion of the Order of Canada, and he holds an astounding 40 honorary doctorates, 38 from Canadian universities. It must be close to every university in Canada, I guess, is pretty much giving you an honorary doctorate, and honorary doctorates from Dartmouth College and Johns Hopkins University. Mr. Lewis, please.
Thank you. I feel as though my entire life is in the past tense. This is a most fascinating panel. Peggy has set out a conceptual design around peacekeeping, which is, I think, entirely credible in its analysis. Mario has given us a sense of the ghastly phenomenon of cholera and what is done to his country, as well as the evidence of sexual exploitation and abuse, all of it in relation to the United Nations. And Beatrice, as always, has set things out with extraordinary clarity in terms of the issues that are involved. I can't begin to approximate those dimensions. I want to potboil some things very quickly because I have run out of patience. I am filled with admiration, affection, regard, near love for the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti and their stoic commitment to achieving social justice. So let me simply remind you, it's not, in fact, a difficult issue. It is known irrefutably that cholera was brought to Haiti by United Nations peacekeepers. Endless studies have given credence to that. And it's just extraordinary that the United Nations pretends that those studies are somehow faulted and will not admit to the reality of everything everyone knows on these fact-based, scientifically based analyses. We know irrefutably of the human toll, which will soon rival the toll that was taken in the case of Ebola. The numbers are still growing. The cholera epidemic, as you've heard from Beatrice, continues. MSF did a recent study which suggests that the 9,000 people who died, as initially suggested, the numbers are actually much greater than that, because in the early days of the pandemic or the epidemic of cholera, the capacity to enumerate those who were ill and died was frayed by the chaos around the disease. We know irrefutably that the UN absolutely disavows responsibility by cowering behind the principle of immunity, and an immunity that was never intended to apply to situations like this. I beg you to recognize that in 1946, when the Convention on Privileges and Immunities took sanction, there was no peacekeeping. There weren't even thoughts of peacekeeping. And to apply it now to this set of facts is an extraordinary aberration from simple common logic. We know irrefutably, as Beatrice has pointed out so strongly, that the standing claims commissions are never used, and that means the UN flouts its own laws with impunity. I want to say something here. There is a sickness at the top of the United Nations. There's a kind of communicable disease on the 38th floor of the United Nations Secretariat that has fatally disabled the organization's moral compass. And this is a serious matter. And the 38th floor is where the offices of the Secretary General sit. We know equally that Ban Ki-moon constantly expresses monumental pain and distress about what's happened. He expresses it particularly when he's in Haiti, but he never apologizes. He never brings himself to an apology. We know equally that the only answer that the UN is able to offer thus far is some additional reparations or renovations of the water and sewage system, but they are incredibly short on dollars. They cannot even raise the money that they have said they must raise in order to restore viable water and sewage systems. And the failure of the UN, frankly, is a direct affront to the many international conventions enshrining human rights. As a matter of fact, if I may make this point, the failure of the UN is a direct affront to the Sustainable Development Goals, which are now so highly cherished. Not only the goal on the right to health, but the goal which says, and I quote, "provide access to justice for all," close quote. What access? What justice? How do you pretend to embody these principles and then to violate them so gratuitously, effortlessly, and constantly as you deal with these international issues? And Ban Ki-moon is not alone. He's doing exactly what his advisors tell him to do. And his advisors are acting on the request of the United States of America. Make no mistake about it. I'm sorry to sound impatient and angry, but like so many in this room, I've supported multilateralism all my adult life, and it grieves me deeply. It is heartbreaking when the United Nations behaves as it is behaving. It's a glorious opportunity for Canada to intervene. Justin Trudeau wants to re-engage with the United Nations. Why not? We have a large Haitian population, as Mario referred to, in Montreal. We have Michael Jean, a former Governor General. We have all kinds of contacts with the country. We have a history. It would make all the sense in the world to have Canada be involved. And one of the ways to restore our reputation with the UN, which was so lamentably discarded over the last 10 dark years of conservative rule, the way to restore the reputation for the UN is to get involved in an issue like this, particularly Haiti and cholera. And if I may be so bold, because I went through this experience myself, Justin Trudeau can instruct the ambassador of Canada, the new ambassador of Canada, to begin negotiations behind the scenes on a variety of fronts. It can be negotiations to get rid of the immunity which resides. It can be negotiations to attempt to have some form of compensation or reparation provided in the way that Beatrice has laid out. I remember Brian Mulroney, the then Prime Minister, calling me and saying, "Stephen, if we do apply economic sanctions against apartheid, I want to know what a certain number of countries will say were we to undertake something which for Canada would be so dramatic." And I polled those countries. I went to them and did my job and reported back to the Prime Minister. There is nothing that stands between a Prime Minister and an ambassador saying, "This is what I'd like you to do on so vexing an issue as Haiti and cholera." It's difficult, because the United States is very reluctant to relinquish the principle of immunity and probably reluctant to pay the freight on compensation and reparations. But where you have a country that has some independent soul, where you have a country that has decent relations with the United Nations and is well regarded internationally, as we will come to be and are even at the moment, you can make great progress. And now, let me say something that is not widely known, but I think I learned it. It only takes one country. That's the way the UN works. If one country initiates the kind of corridor discussions, behind-the-scenes negotiations, or open and public exchange on an issue like this, the floodgates will open. The logjam will break. But for the last 5.5 years, no country has been willing to do that, no matter how hard people like the Institute for Justice and Democracy have attempted to prevail upon them. One country can open the doors on this issue. Because the way the UN works, when a country says they want to do something, everybody feels they should at least try to accommodate it. I saw it 100 times when I was the permanent representative. And many times I thought that the propositions were preposterous. And yet we danced to the tune of the preposterous because a country had recommended it. A nation state carries a lot of weight in the UN if it takes a stand. And if Canada were to take this stand, I firmly believe that we would open the door. We would have sotto voce conversations in the corridor. And I want to say to you that because of the extraordinary lobbying and work that has been done by outfits like the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti, there is a subterranean discussion taking place now amongst many countries. How do we end this horror story? How do we come to some kind of rapprochement? How do we come to an agreement? And if one country was bold enough to step forward, I have to say to you, there would be a settlement down the road. Now, I want to raise one other fact, which was obviously spoken to by Mario and the Uruguayan peacekeepers, and sexual exploitation and abuse, which is the particular term that is used by the United Nations to describe acts of sexual violence. Sexual exploitation and abuse has become an extraordinarily explosive issue at the United Nations at the moment amongst peacekeepers engaging in these activities. against the civilian population they are designed to protect. They are there to protect. It's become an extraordinary issue at the UN. It is the fulcrum of discussion everywhere. It's absolutely fascinating. It has become an obsessive subject, thank goodness. And I want to say to you with some pride that it has been largely introduced into the UN by the work of AIDS Free World, and particularly by my co-director, Paula Donovan, who first took the evidence of the abuse of the little boys in the Central African Republic to The Guardian, and then was the architect of our entire approach on this subject matter, and has been the chief protagonist, doing God knows hundreds of interviews. And we have maintained this insistent focus on what is happening to the United Nations precisely because we believe in peacekeeping. And we're damned if we're going to see it rendered in ignominy because of these contentious episodes of sexual exploitation and abuse, which are not incidental, which are not a few bad apples, but which are a systemic problem for the United Nations. And now I want to say that, I know how this sounds, believe me. And I don't care anymore. I'm 78 years old. I don't give a tinker's damn whether or not you find me repugnant in my assertive and somewhat aggressive views. I have to say to you that the United Nations is the heart and soul of international society. And it's heartbreaking when they behave as they behave in the upper echelons. And things were so bad in the situation of sexual exploitation and abuse in the Central African Republic, the inheritance of Haiti, what's gone in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in so many countries where there are peacekeeping operations, where peacekeepers, military and non-military, many non-military administrative staff who constitute on the average 51% of the incidents of sexual exploitation and abuse, even though they constitute a great minority of the overall peacekeeping contingent. So it's military and non-military. It's United Nations and non-United Nations. We have a real crisis on our hands, the crisis of accountability to which Beatrice referred. Things got so bad that the Secretary General of the United Nations was forced to appoint a committee of review, an external committee of review, and it was chaired by a former Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, Justice Marie Deschamps, and she delivered her report on December 17th, 2015, and I want to tell you, in all my years of multilateralism, I've never seen such a merciless indictment of the United Nations. She called it, and I'm quoting exactly, a gross institutional failure. And she named, amongst others, the Chief of Staff of the Secretary General of the UN, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Executive Director of UNICEF, and 3 other people whom she accused of abuse of authority sitting in high positions. In other words, she found the incipient conspiracy of silence amongst a great many of the senior officials of the United Nations. Can you imagine it in this day and age, sitting on the terrible violations that had occurred for month after month and never making them public, and what's worse, never responding to them adequately. And now the incidents pour forth as we learn more and more. So AIDS Free World, if you want to go to a website, Code Blue Campaign, we've suggested a very serious response rather than the ad hoc incremental spasms to which the United Nations is occasionally given as it looks at reform. We're suggesting, number one, a full investigation, not a review, but a full investigation be given. We're suggesting, number two, an external oversight panel in real time, which will follow everything that occurs on sexual exploitation and abuse, and be appointed by member states and be reporting to member states, and then it can be returned to the United Nations with everything is put on an even keel. And finally, a form of criminal accountability worked into every single peacekeeping mission, so that the appropriate judicial processes can be followed if people feel the host state is unable to do so. I must end. You know, I understand and agree with Peggy's assessment of the importance of peacekeeping, and I don't want it to be subsumed forever in this consternation and aggravation about sexual exploitation and abuse, but we have to solve it. We just must solve it. And the United Nations is not able to solve it. The Deschamps report indicated they're just paralyzed. They haven't the faintest idea what to do. And that's why we are fiercely lobbying countries about the possibility of finding an alternative. We've been going downhill, for 10 years during the tenure of the present Secretary General. I have to say he may be the loveliest human being on the planet, but with the greatest respect, he hasn't been a consummate and adequate first citizen of the world. And I thank whatever creator some of you believe in that we're going to have in early January 2017, we're going to have a woman Secretary General, and it can't come soon enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lewis. So I guess we all have a fair idea what the panelists think. Now we've got about 20 minutes or so for some questions. I'd ask that you identify yourself and try to direct your question to a specific panelist, and please be concise. I'll take a few questions in a row, and we'll begin with the gentleman here.
It can also bring other people from other countries to be trained there. That's also important from that perspective. But as long as that center has not been established, whether the academic institution have a role to play. For example, I'm referring to our faculty here. Is it really playing the role to train about the legal aspects of the UN operations? I have spent 7 years here. My experience has been that we have talented students here, not from Canada, but international students. They are talented. They are very interested to learn about UN. But I think our program, JD program, has to be revisited in the light of the new policies of the government to see what we can do more until that center is established.
Thank you very much. Professor?
Thanks, John. Stephen, this is a question for you. Amir Ataran, University of Ottawa.
Yeah, I recognize you, Amir.
Hello, Stephen. Look, you make the point very well that under the current UN leadership, which is appalling, something very precious, peacekeeping, has turned into a bit of a cesspool, the sort of cesspool from which the cholera disease might be thought of as emanating. Here's a question, though. Is it not yet time to understand that simply giving money to this administration, this UN administration, to behave as they like, will actually lead to greater travesties of this sort? And therefore, time to say, if the UN doesn't want to step up to its financial liability to the cholera victims, Canada, the United States, other nations that contribute funds should simply reduce their funds by a sufficient amount to pay those claims. Should we just dock the UN budget if the UN doesn't want to do this? Not so that we enrich ourselves, but so that money goes through some other channel as compensation to the victims. The reason I say this is because in common law, in our system of law, this is what you do. If you have a party that has a liability and that is in default of its obligations to pay that liability, you garnish the money from someone upstream and you give it to the person that is owed. I'm troubled that we continue shoveling money at the UN when it doesn't want to meet its liabilities, and I'm to the point of thinking we should simply garnish the funds, give them to the victims, and that will teach the 38th floor a lesson. Do you agree?
No.
We'll just take a third question. Ms. McCaskey?
Yeah, Carolyn McCaskey. Some of you know me as having spent 9 years in the UN in positions in humanitarian coordination, peacekeeping, and peace building. I would like to dispel this widely held belief that the UN is sitting on pots of money. The UN Secretariat budget is barely equivalent to the budget of the city of Ottawa. So if you're going to garnish, if you're going to stop the contributions, our contributions are really not that much. First of all,
Peacekeeping, $7 billion a year.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's over and above.
Yeah.
We're not throwing money at this. There is the peacekeeping budget is used to pay for troop contributing countries. I think the comments that have been made by the panelists about the role of member states is something that has to be remembered. We have a crisis at the top right now. I mean, I agree. I always agree with Stephen and his impassioned pleas.
It's because I ask you what I should say in advance.
Yes. I worked for Kofi Annan and I worked for Ban Ki-moon, and I think the expression night and day is appropriate. The fact is that for the UN, this, and Peggy put it well, this mythical UN, the UN is a group of member states making decisions through the process of a series of secretariats. And a lot of things going on. It's also a very archaic organization. It is an organization which has committees of the whole, 198 member states who sit around and tell the UN who they can hire, how they can make decisions, where the money should go, where every penny should go. It is, even if you had a brilliant management team, the process is endlessly debilitating. And this is where the reform has to come in. Stephen's absolutely right. You can fix things one at a time with a big idea and a leader prepared to carry it. But the basic process of how it works has to be tackled. My own knowledge of friends inside the UN is that there were many people who tried to get the UN to stand up. But let's not forget that Stephen Harper stood up in the Canadian Parliament and apologized for the residential schools. And 10 years later, we still haven't paid up. You know, there's an awful lot of things wrong with the UN because it's the sum compound of all the things that are wrong in member states. And there's also another factor. You have people in that organization who do not understand the common concepts of accountability that we live in. 4 months after I joined the UN, I went out on a mission to look at what the UN was doing for IDPs, because a very senior ambassador in New York criticized us. And I gave my report to the Secretary General's Executive Committee, and then I took him aside and I said, I'd like to see you privately. And I walked in to his office, and it wasn't a private meeting. There were 2 other senior people from the 38th floor there. And I thought, too bad, they'll hear this. I said, Secretary General, I only told you half the story out there. If Ambassador X had seen what I saw, we'd be all over the United Nations. We'd be all over the front page of the New York Times. And I'm telling you this because you're the boss and you need to know the worst if it comes out. But I'm also here to tell you, as the responsible official, we're fixing it. In other words, what do you know? When did you know it? What are you doing about it? And I observed those principles. And I walked out of Kofi Annan's office, and the 2 colleagues with me turned around and said, oh my God, what did you do? You just told Kofi Annan you weren't doing a good job. That's the atmosphere that you have to contend with. That has to be changed. Anyway, I have all sorts of little notes of things I'd like to say, but time marches on, and so other people.
Peggy, do you want to take the first question?
I'm actually not sure if I'm the best one. I mean, about other institutions, I mean, I would reiterate absolutely that the whole point of the International Peacekeeping Training would be a Canadian International Peacekeeping Training Center. But in addition to civil and military, it's really important that there be, in addition to Canadian military, that there be funding, and we have a funding mechanism, the Military Training Assistance Program, that would allow international peacekeepers, militaries from developing countries to participate, and then also other countries, Western countries, some could participate as well. So it's absolutely fundamental that there not just be Canadian. I mean, because the whole point of the training is so that you understand, working in an international environment. But in terms of others, I mean, you said what other institutions? I mean, I don't know, John. I look at you. You might have some comments on what other institutions. I mean, it's a hard one. Universities can provide theory, of course, a course on international humanitarian law, that kind of thing. But the point about the international training centers is that you're replicating, in a sense, a mission in mini. And there are also things like exercises, practical exercises. So it's not an academic environment. I mean, it's a training environment.
If I can just add, the Pearson Peacekeeping Center famously trained peacekeeping personnel and others from around the world, so it did what you were suggesting. Yes, exactly. And there's a lot I bump into them all the time all over the world who are grateful and actually learned their elements of their skills and so forth here in Canada, and they're just aghast that we don't do it anymore. But to answer the question more broadly, we do have here in the law school, actually, together with the Canadian Red Cross and increasingly with the active participation of the Canadian Armed Forces, a one-week summer school on international humanitarian law. And we added last year, and we will continue this, a day-long simulation. But let me make a distinction here between training and basic education or briefings. Yeah. I remember when I used to work at the United Nations in the early 1990s, and I was I was then working for the Center for Human Rights before there was a High Commission for Human Rights, and I was sent to former Yugoslavia, it was then Yugoslavia still, amidst the crisis, and there was a civilian police deployment made. Now, what does that mean? That means that the United Nations agrees upon a deployment and then asks countries to send their police. These people came from all over the place, had never been to the country, didn't speak the language, and never had any common training. And they were given a one-day briefing that was called a training. Now, you may imagine the disparate kind of characters that were in this force or this group of civilians. We received, while we were there, complaints from some local people that they had been beaten up by, I won't mention the country, but some contributed United Nations police, civilian police. And we inquired about it, and we asked, well, what happened? And they said, we just effected an arrest. For them, effecting an arrest meant beat up the local people. So it's not even sufficient to, we really have to talk about serious training. And as far as I know, there is a general paucity of this around the world. We don't seriously, and what's really happened in peacekeeping, the $7 billion that Professor Amatan referred to, is really Canada and financing countries are basically derelict. What we do now is we contribute money for troop contributing countries who make money. So it's much cheaper for Bangladesh or other countries to make money by sending people to do peacekeeping, who, by the way, don't then want to be held responsible. God forbid they be held responsible. Yeah. They exactly want to be there, continue to receive and validate the income they earn through the transfers through peacekeeping, and God knows what kind of training they have. Well, there's some improvements, but we're very far from an accountable system. Mr. Lewis, you had some questions.
I'm reluctant to disagree with Amir because I've spent my life enjoying his somewhat unorthodox responses to social predicaments. But Amir, the great hazard in the suggestion is the opening of the door to canceling contributions in a larger extent. After all, there was both two congressional subcommittees in the United States that met just 2 weeks ago at the Senate level and Congress level, and at the Senate level, they were talking about canceling the entire contribution to the United Nations because of sexual exploitation and abuse. There is a danger that there are enough governments of unstable analytic capacity in this world that we would do the United Nations great damage if we tried to, in a sense, garnish and redistribute the monies. I think we actually do stand a chance. I can't believe I'm saying this as a lifelong socialist, but I think we do stand a chance with the current government that if they took this forward, we might well be able to break the logjam at the UN on behalf of the cholera victims in Haiti. I sense a door is opening. One other thing, I discerned in Carolyn McCaskey's observation a question, which she will not have discerned, but I wanted to answer it anyway, so I'm noting it. I agree with you that the member states really get away with a lot, and that the United Nations is composed of it's 193, by the way, member states. But in truth, in truth, the Secretariat of the UN has a lot of authority and power if they were willing to exercise it. And there is such an atmosphere of fear, apprehension, and diffidence at the UN that it's not exercised. That's very much what the Deschamps report pointed out, that you had all these people who could have made a qualitative difference in the lives of those who were victimized, and they chose instead a conspiracy of silence. Here they had reports on 6 little boys. Kayla, was it 6? I think on 6. Kayla Mintz, who is our project director for the entire Code Blue operation, is sitting here in the front row for those of you who want a more informed response to what we're doing. But 6 little boys who were forced to perform fellatio, and then on 1 or 2 of them they were sodomized. And they identified the perpetrators by virtue of tattoos and nose rings and all kinds of items that made it clear who the perpetrators were. That was in May and June of 2014. In July, that information went directly to the government of France. It's May of 2016. There hasn't been a single charge, not an indictment, not a trial, nobody punished. This is France I'm talking about. So you can imagine that these countries are so arrogant in their behavior, and the United Nations Secretariat is so tentative in responding. That's why we've got to find a group of member states who are more willing to be involved. That's why we wanted to take it out of the UN, where you're dealing with sexual exploitation and abuse, and put it more firmly in the hands of a group of states who would be resolute, because the way it stands now, it's just paralytic. It's absolutely astonishing. And who loses in all of this? The victims. No one cares about the victims. They are always at the end of the line. It's incredible.
Beatrice, you want to add to that?
Sure. Just a quick note on the cost of this. I mean, I think I certainly agree that we understand that the UN is not sitting on a huge pot of money, and certainly that underfunding of the UN system at large is an ongoing chronic problem that also needs to be addressed, and certainly something that we would like to see addressed. At the same time, when we talk about the costs of accountability, I think it's also important to look at the costs and benefits of accountability more broadly. So to give you one example, the UN and the Haitian government together have launched a plan to eliminate cholera from Haiti that they have estimated will cost $2.2 billion over 10 years. Now, that's a tremendous amount of money, $2.2 billion. But at the same time, if you put it in the context of peacekeeping, the UN has spent between $500 million and $1 billion every year in Haiti since 2010, when cholera was introduced. And I think one of the points that came through very clearly in Mario's presentation is the fact that if Haitians had a say in where this money were to go, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find people who would prefer that it goes to military actions in a country that hasn't had a war in our lifetime, instead of to water and sanitation that has the potential to save thousands of lives every year. And so certainly I don't mean to be naive about the difficulty of engaging political processes to get to an endpoint where we invest in this. But ultimately, I think the question is about political will and not about a hard lack of resources.
Bravo. Bravo. Did you notice the Pentagon? Just that the Pentagon, in response to the bombing of the MSF hospital in Afghanistan, not only will there be no criminal liability, just administrative discipline, but did you notice the amount of money they offered? They offered per person who had died $6,000, and for person who had been injured, $3,000. The way in which the military mind and the military frame works, which has kind of infected the way things are being looked at in the UN, is such a violation of basic human rights. It's astonishing. So what Beatrice says is right. It wouldn't take much to resolve this problem. The UN could collect it if they wanted to.
Take another few questions. Et vos questions sont également bienvenues en français. Madam?
International training, pre-deployment training for police officers in other countries, and did a lot of work with the former Pearson Peacekeeping Center. And I just recently returned from the as investigator of war crimes for UNICAT. I was there for the year of 2015. And just some points that have been raised here were really interesting because we've actually done work on the ground with police officers on the ground, and just the differences in Canada. Police officers in Canada, we held to a very high standard for training. In fact, if I wanted to go back to another mission right now, I'd have to really go through a lot of physical training and everything else, and extensive psychological and everything else, just to be mission ready. And yet, I've been to other countries where we've actually delivered training to other police officers in other countries. And remember seeing somebody handling a firearm one time, and I actually hit the ground because I didn't want to get shot. But the point there was that the level is not the same. The experience is not the same. There were 3 of us at UNICAT recently for 2015 from Canada, and before we got there, there were no. They didn't have gender balance. We achieved gender balance just by being there. And also we did a lot of the investigation, but a lot of them were the GBV investigations that hadn't been done, we were doing as well. But we consistently, our stats were consistently much higher than everybody else. We were up here and everybody else started from here. And our work ethic goes, it speaks for itself. But the thing is, the accountability, I think, was mentioned there. That's a huge thing. Because a lot of the police officers on the ground from other countries, I mean, I treat instructing police officers from countries that I've mentioned, when they're saying to us, you Canadians, yeah, you can say that when you interrogate somebody, you don't touch them and you don't threaten them. But with me, whether he did it or not, by the time I'm done with him, he'll say he did it. So that's what you're dealing with on the ground. So.
There were some questions over here. Yes, madam.
I was curious about the comment that you made, and then you sort of left it. You talked about the fact that it's the U.S. who's calling the shots on the UN's attitudes towards how it's responding to the cholera litigation. And so I'm curious about that. I'm wondering why the U.S. would be interested in sort of blocking or directing the UN to not acknowledge any kind of accountability for their actions in Haiti. And then in light of that, and in light of your comment about how France has been aware since 2014 about the activity of their own people, and here we are in 2016, nobody has been prosecuted in France. They're a member of the Security Council. So how do you suggest that other member states get together and hold the UN accountable when you have the U.S. Calling the shots on the accountability issue on cholera, which, as you say, is irrefutable. And then if you have a member of the Security Council who's not even holding their own people accountable, how can other countries, including Canada, stand up and say, okay, UN, you've got to start doing your job when you have these other more powerful countries out there?
It's a very, very good question, and not an easy one to answer, and it exposes how facile I was in what I put. But I think that the great concern in the United States is dollars. If they decide to relinquish immunity, if a standing claims commission comes into place, if reparations and compensation is seriously considered, the United States will have to pay a significant portion of it, probably equal to their level of contribution to peacekeeping overall, which must be something around 23 or 25%. And I think that they're just they're determined that that will not happen, that there'll be no further costs absorbed. So they take this stand. I'm so naive that when I went to listen to Beatrice and Brian and the Institute for Justice and Democracy argue the case for the first time in the Manhattan court, and I was just astonished when up to oppose them to defend immunity was the United States prosecutor. And I couldn't figure that out. There was no UN person in the building. Here they were discussing immunity in a UN convention, and the UN never came to defend itself. It was the United States. The United States said, well, we are signature to the convention. We have a right to do that. It's on our soil, et cetera, et cetera. But, of course, it speaks to the way the US deals with it. The situation of France is really difficult because not only have they done nothing to arrest the Sangari soldiers who are involved, but they make these extraordinary speeches about how hideous sexual exploitation and abuse is and how the UN must desperately do something about it or it will be forever scarred. I mean, the hypocrisy sits like lead on the tongue, and it's hard to put up with it. I don't know the answer to your question. When I was at the UN, there was a group of like-minded middle-sized countries with good reputations, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, a couple of the Scandinavian bloc, a country like Holland. You know, there's a kind of clutch of 6 or 8 Western countries, and you can find equally Latin American, Asian, and African countries. So you bring together 10 or 12 like-minded countries who would find that this is an important issue to resolve. Somebody has to initiate it. I know this sounds so simple-minded it seems odd, but as soon as a country steps forward, it opens the door. It always does. I could never figure out how it worked, but that's what happens.
There were a few questions left. We're already at 7 o'clock, after 7 o'clock. I'll take the 3 questions I saw. There's a lady in the front, and I saw 2 more over here. So, please.
Yes, since I can't ask my question in any language, so I will ask it in French. J'aimerais savoir ce que vous pensez justement en fonction de tout ce qui a été dit, de toutes les violations des droits humains que cette organisation est au courant et qu'il y a certains pays qui décident de ne pas agir du tout. Est-ce que ce ne serait pas plus sage pour les pays comme Haïti et d'autres pays qui sont vulnérables et qui sont assis autour de la table et qui ne peuvent pas prendre de décision, de tout simplement laisser cette organisation-là, parce que c'est leur présence, en fait, qui donne une certaine légitimité, justement, aux Nations Unies. Est-ce que ce n'est pas mieux maintenant, là, pour que ça leur donne cette impression, ou clairement, l'indication comme quoi on est tous fatigués de cette façon de faire?
Gentleman in the front here.
Thank you very much for bringing the conversation and all of the amazing work you do. My question is for you, Stephen. Appreciate all of the passion and charisma you bring to these issues. You shared a story about your time when Brian Mulroney would essentially instruct you and lead you. And what would it look like today if you could reverse those roles with Prime Minister Trudeau? And on the issue specifically about sexual violence that you're so passionate about, if you had his ear and could instruct him, what would it look like that you would like Canada's response to be?
You mean when Justin was ambassador and I was prime minister?
No,
what exactly are you saying? I mean, I live in a fantasy world, but it's not as rich as yours.
Just if you could, what would you like Canada's response to be?
And I thought I saw one other hand over there, or is it now suppressed? Okay, those seem to be the two. If just allow me one note, Stephen, we were mentioning like-minded countries. One of the things that's changed the last number of years, particularly in terms of the European Union's enlargement, so the Nordic countries now, with the exception of Norway, which are European Union countries, now are subject to a consensus position. That's true. Where there used to be, for example, on the Human Rights Commission and elsewhere, you could expect Finland or Sweden to take particular positions. They now can't. They are basically brought down to the common denominator. So if France says, or it doesn't have to be France, it could be Hungary, simply says we don't like this, it's not going ahead for the 28 member states of the European Union. So the importance of finding the Norways, the Switzerlands, the Canada, a few others is quite crucial now. And that actually means that Canada's voice would have more special significance than previously. The questions which were put.
Thank you.
Ah bon, je voulais bien répondre à la question de Fabienne. Oui, et en Haïti, on est en train de nous poser cette question. Pourquoi Haïti est membre de toutes ces organisations? Pourquoi faire? Même si on prend l'OEA aussi. L'OEA, par exemple. Et nous pensons que l'OEA fait beaucoup plus de mal à Haïti, par exemple, et en tant qu'observateur des élections. Mais le problème, c'est que il y a un moyen de faire par les grands pays, le Canada, les États-Unis, etc., etc. C'est-à-dire, il invite Haïti, par exemple, le président provisoire a été à New York justement pour signer le COP21, sans aucun débat en Haïti, plus rien, mais il y a, je ne sais pas si c'est un Canadien, si c'est un Français, si c'est un Américain, mais qui lui a conseillé de faire, et c'est toujours le cas. Mais écoutez, si on prend l'OEA, le Canada ne reconnaît pas la compétence de la Cour interaméricaine des droits humains. Mais on demande à Haïti d'être membre. C'est la même chose en Afrique. Le CPI est fait pour les Africains, pas pour Bush, pas pour ourselves. Donc moi, c'est ce qu'on est en train de faire, de voir. Et cette question d'argent qui tourne et retourne, moi je pense la bonne question qu'il faut poser, si vous êtes vraiment équilibré, quel est le fondement de cette mission en Haïti? Pourquoi? Regardons l'article 7 de la Charte des Nations Unies. Est-ce que Haïti était en guerre? Est-ce que Haïti était une menace pour la paix, pour ses voisins proches? Donc, c'est la situation. Maintenant, vous vous plaignez de l'argent, mais écoutez, c'est 500 millions de dollars que les Nations Unies dépensent et il n'y a pas d'argent pour les victimes. Il n'y a pas d'argent pour ceux qui sont tués par la MINUSTAH. Moi, je ne comprends pas ce monde dont nous vivons. Hein. Je ne comprends pas ce monde. Je vois une démocratie aux États-Unis, une démocratie en Haïti, une autre en Haïti. Et il y a une façon de faire des élections aux États-Unis, au Canada, mais en Haïti, il y a une autre façon. Non, mes amis, écoutez. Si vous parlez de démocratie, il faut parler d'une démocratie, que ce soit pour les pays riches ou pour les pays pauvres. Et il faut cesser avec cette hypocrisie. Il faut cesser cette hypocrisie. Pourquoi la MINUSTAH en Haïti? Pourquoi? Alors c'est pour faire la démocratie? Ou bien c'est pour protéger les intérêts des multinationalistes? Pourquoi la MINUSTAH est en Haïti? Est-ce que ce n'est pas pour protéger Sainte-Genève qui exploite l'or, une compagnie canadienne qui exploite l'or dans le nord-est d'Haïti? Dis-nous. Il faut répondre à cette question aussi. Et de dire tout simplement, nous avons nos intérêts. Aujourd'hui, il y a des victimes et des collatéraux. Vous ne voulez pas les compenser? Je ne comprends pas. Et vous dépensez chaque année 5 millions de dollars. Maintenant, vous ne voulez pas... Écoutez, ceux qui sont morts. Parce qu'ils sont des Haïtiens. Bon, imaginez-vous, une fois, le choléra arrive, je ne souhaite pas, au Canada, par le biais de la MINUSTAH ou bien. Imaginez-vous. Moi, je pense, en fait, généralement, c'est vraiment horrible d'entendre cette question. Oui, pourquoi Haïti est membre de ces organisations? Oui.
If I can just add one note to that, it's that I think that regardless of whether this problem is addressed within the structure of the United Nations or we look beyond that, that in our globalized world today, what we're seeing more and more is violations of human rights that come from actors that are not purely governments, that come from the, sometimes with the influence of governments, but we have international financial institutions, we have the UN, we have corporations, and we have to find ways to resolve that regardless of what the individual structure is that we're talking about and the context is in which these injuries unfold. And I think that that's a challenge that is not just for Canada's political leaders to confront, it's not just for Haiti's political leaders to confront, it's not just for the Secretary General to confront, but also a broader issue that I think all of us here in this room have to think about and have a role to play in addressing. And one of the things that I think a unique opportunity that exists within the framework of the cholera crisis is also the ability of individuals, people like Mario, people like yourselves, to raise your voices and to ask your governments, to ask the people in power to respond to this. Because what we can't do anymore is rely on those political processes, those established systems to be the only ones to move these issues forward. And I think that's how we've ultimately come to this moment here. I know we spent a lot of time talking about the lack of accountability, the very grave injustices that are playing out in Haiti and in other places of the world, but I think it's also important to recognize that this is an issue that's come a tremendously long way from a time several years ago when cholera first broke out in Haiti, and the headlines were essentially angry Haitians blame benevolent peacekeepers, to an understanding now that I believe is pretty uniform that there was a terrible wrongdoing at the heart of what happened in Haiti, and that means that we have to do something. And the issue didn't move into that space on its own. It moved into that space due to the persistent advocacy of Haitians, of victims of cholera, but also through the efforts of Friends of Haiti, of people in audiences like this who used whatever role they have, whether it be as a student writing an article, whether it be as somebody in a political office to think about these issues and to raise awareness and to push it forward. And I think that's the challenge of the world in which we live in, whether it be the UN who's responsible or a multinational corporation. And it's a challenge I think we all have to rise up to.
Great.
Before I turn the floor over to Mr. Lewis to answer the question, I guess you're still thinking what you tell Justin. But Peggy, I saw you writing furiously. Do you have a few words to share in conclusion?
I was going to say, I thought that was an absolutely wonderful note to end on, Beatrice. But no, the only thing I was, just on the training side, the Pearson Peacekeeping Center was actually the founding secretariat for the International Association of Peacekeeping Training Centers, and there now are a great deal of them. Both, I mean, they're primarily either military or police, because there was a recognition of the really important need of having police training. And they have some of them have some civilian elements, but the Pearson Peacekeeping Center was the first one. So back in 1995, to recognize that you had to have the interdisciplinary approach. And there still aren't that many that follow that broad approach. But I just wanted to, make the point that there are a great number of international training centers, and we then can build on that. And that's why when I talk about developing the doctrine and the standard operating procedures, we've got a network that we can feed that out to, get agreement, and then bring it back so that they become a firmer commitment, as part of the, ultimately, a meaningful part of the standard of the status of mission agreements, and not just a part that's ignored.
Well, if we're going to send more than 30 or 31 Canadians, I think is the number right now, if we're going to start sending more Canadians, like the police officer recounted, it's in our interest that they be in environments where other people contributing to other peacekeepers and civilians in peacekeeping operations are adequately trained and so forth.
Exactly.
Mr. Lewis, have you thought of the response?
I'm working on it. I think that it's perfectly plausible for the Prime Minister to pick up the phone and phone his ambassador and say, we'd like to resolve this terrible issue of Haiti and cholera. Most of us recognize that a grievous injustice was done. And I'd like you quietly and behind the scenes to canvass those governments that you think, those ambassadors that you think might be similarly sympathetic. And when you have found 4 or 5 of them, I'm going to ask Stéphane Dion, my foreign minister, to be in touch with their foreign ministers to begin to set up an avenue of negotiation. And I think that I really believe deeply in my soul that that would open it up, that that's all it would take. I mean, when President Obama is making jokes about Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister has risen to celestial heights, and it would now be possible to break things open. And I accept what Beatrice says. This is the kind of issue which has to bring all of us into it. But ultimately, forgive me, ultimately, you've got to rely on your political structures to break through. Or it's not going to happen. And if the politicians, well placed, will actually do something, I think we're okay. And in truth, everything Beatrice said results in politicians doing that. It's this advocacy. It's these people putting pressure on our politicians. It's the meetings that the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti had today. It's those kinds of things which gradually open the doors. I think it can happen, but it may not. I mean, you know, these things. Everybody is frightened of offending the United States of America, and so they go slow.
Well, please join me in thanking the panel for their contributions. And thank you for coming. And thanks again to Adam for the initiative on this. Have a good evening.